The first thing the viewer would see is not a living man, but a face carved in stone, half buried beneath centuries of shifting desert sands. The eyes, though fixed in unblinking stillness, seem alive. They are heavy-lidded, contemplative, as if staring past the horizon into some truth long hidden. Around the sculpture's crown, grains of ochre sand drift like the slow fall of time itself. This is all that remains of a ruler whose name is lost, a man who once commanded an entire city of water and stone, the Priest-King of Mohenjo-Daro. His silence is older than any empire we remember, and yet, if one leans close enough, feels as though he is about to speak. The story does not begin in ruins. It begins with the living city, when the Indus River ran deep and the air shimmered with heat. Brick walls glowed a deep rust red, the color of baked clay drawn from the river's banks. Above them rose watchtowers and granaries, their silhouettes sharp against the pale sky. The city's breath was the smell of wet earth after rain, the tang of river water carried down from the mountains, and the faint spice of distant markets. From high above, the city would have seemed almost impossibly ordered, like the board of a game no one had yet learned to play. Broad streets intersected at right angles, dividing the city into blocks. Each house was built from identical bricks, the same size, the same form, as though uniformity itself was a law written by the gods. Hidden beneath those streets ran a secret world, the steps descending into still, dark water. This was no place for idle swimming. Here, the air was heavy with incense, and the sun filtered in through high openings, turning the water into molten bronze in the afternoon light. It was a place of purification, of rites whose meanings have dissolved in time, but whose gravity was felt in every stone. It was here that the priest-king's presence was most often felt. A figure robed in patterned cloth, the weight of a banded headdress pressing against his brow, his expression unreadable. His reign was not written in ink or carved in stone, but in the rhythm of the city's life. He was the unseen hand that ensured grain filled the granaries before the floods, that merchants from far lands paid their dues, that the festivals of fire and water took place without fail. People did not speak his name. They bowed their heads in the streets, murmuring titles: Keeper of the Waters, Voice of the Ancestors, Guardian of the Grid. To the commoner, he was both a man and an idea, born into a house whose wealth came from both the temple and the market. The young heir was taught to read the silent script etched into seals, tiny, intricate carvings of animals and symbols whose meanings are still lost to us. He learned the patterns of the river's rise and fall, how to measure the length of the shadow cast by the midday sun, how to hear the unspoken in the council of elders. Yet even in youth, he carried a dual burden: his father's expectation that he master the politics of men, and his mother's insistence that he guard the sanctity of the divine. The decisive turn in his early life came with the flood. In his 16th year, the monsoon swelled the Indus beyond its banks, sending black water rushing through the streets, filling courtyards and markets, sweeping away livestock and goods. The boy stood on the high steps of the great bath as the floodwaters surged past, hearing the distant screams of those trapped in the lower quarters. When the waters receded, the city smelled of rot. Bodies lay tangled with driftwood and clay pots in the silt. He learned to see the city as a living thing, one that required constant tending. He walked its streets at dawn, when the merchants were still shuttered inside their homes, to inspect the channels where water and waste flowed. He studied the markets when the caravans arrived, taking note of how weights were balanced and goods exchanged, and made mental notes of which stores would last through the dry season. This was his education, not in the abstract ideals of kingship, but in the everyday pulse of the city that would one day be his to hold. When his father's health began to fail, the council of elders summoned him to take on greater duties. It was a quiet transfer of power, marked not by coronation but by an oath in the great bath. Standing waist-deep in the cool water, he closed his eyes as priests poured vessels of scented oil over his head, each drop spreading in iridescent swirls across the surface before dissolving. The people gathered around the rim of the bath watched in silence, for they knew that from this day onward, the young man's life no longer belonged to himself. He was bound to the city, to its rituals, its politics, its survival. As the seasons turned, his rule began to take shape. He ordered the clearing of silt from the main canals, decreed new regulations for traders, and restored the temple fires after a year of neglect. Under his guidance, Mohenjo-Daro seemed to hum with renewed vitality. Festivals glowed brighter, processions moved with greater discipline, and the markets bustled with goods from distant lands. Beads from the Persian Gulf, copper from Rajasthan, cotton cloth dyed in deep indigo. But prosperity carries its own dangers. In the shadowed corners of the market, whispers began to rise. Some said the new ruler was too concerned with the sanctity of ritual, a woman whose dowry could shift the balance of power between temple and market. These whispers did not reach him directly, but he could feel their weight in the way the council spoke to him, in the way certain elders hesitated before bowing. He had learned early that power is not just the right to act, but the constant vigilance against the erosion of trust. And trust, in Mohenjo-Daro, as the sun bled into the horizon and the city's shadows lengthened, he stood atop the citadel mound and looked down at the perfect geometry of the streets. In that moment, the city seemed eternal. The silent crown upon his head was not made of gold, but of responsibility, and its weight could not be seen, only felt in the quiet hours before dawn. A crack was forming, and in years to come, that crack would widen into a wound that no ritual could heal. The stone face half buried in the sands would one day be all that remained. But here, in the living light of Mohenjo-Daro's zenith, the priest-king still walked the streets, still stood upon the steps of the great bath. The river had always been the city's lifeline, but in the years after his ascension, the priest-king came to see it as something more dangerous, a silent predator waiting for its moment. The Indus did not roar like an ocean storm. It crept forward, swelling slowly, almost imperceptibly, until its waters swallowed the lower quarters. The people believed the floods came in cycles, like a great breath drawn by the gods. But he had stood at the water's edge as a boy and seen the way the current tore away the earth grain by grain. It was not divine rhythm he saw, but the patient work of destruction. It was in his third year of rule that the river tested him. The monsoon rains fell longer than the elders remembered, turning the air into a heavy, unbroken sheet of heat and moisture. In the highlands far to the north, the meltwater surged, and the Indus began to rise. First, it was no more than a familiar nuisance. Traders lifting their goods onto platforms, children splashing in shallow puddles that formed in the streets. But the water did not retreat. Each morning, it inched higher. By the fifth day, it was lapping at the doors of the grain stores in the southern district. He ordered the workers to build barriers of brick and clay, a desperate attempt to hold back a force older than the city itself. The walls went up quickly, a testament to the discipline he had instilled, but the river laughed at their effort, pushing forward until it breached the first line of defense. What followed was not a rush, but a slow drowning. The water seeped into the streets, curling around the base of houses, sliding into the drainage channels, turning the neat geometry of the city into a map of shimmering, stagnant pools. From the high citadel, he watched the market quarter disappear beneath the silver sheen. Rooflines became islands. The cries of merchants rose through the humid air as they saw bales of cotton and sacks of grain dissolve into useless pulp. The smell of wet earth was soon overpowered by the sour rot of food and the stench of drowned livestock. In the great bath, the sacred water mixed with muddy runoff, clouding the reflection of the temple fires above. It was then that the first rumors began. Murmurs that the gods were displeased, that the priest-king had failed to perform the proper rites. He responded not with proclamations, but with presence. Wading through the waist-deep water in the lower streets, he oversaw the relocation of families to the higher terraces. He ordered the granaries on the citadel mound open to feed those who had lost everything. Workers labored under his watch to drain the pools that had formed between houses. Among the merchants, there were those who saw in the flood not disaster, but opportunity. Grain prices rose, and with them, resentment. Wealth began to shift quietly, pooling in the hands of those who could control what little food remained dry. These men smiled in the public assemblies, bowing low to the priest-king, but in the shadows of their warehouses, they whispered plans to loosen the temple's grip on power. One night, as the water began to recede, the bodies surfaced. Some were children, swollen and pale, their limbs tangled in fishing nets. Others were men and women whose faces were hidden beneath silt, their clothes torn by the current. The smell was unbearable. Workers tied strips of cloth across their noses as they carried the dead to the outskirts for burial. The priest-king followed the grim procession in silence, his bare feet sinking into the wet earth with each step. He had known that rule meant bearing the weight of the living. Now he understood it also meant carrying the dead. When the river finally withdrew, it left behind a city scarred. The lower quarters were a mosaic of cracked mud and collapsed walls. The markets were quiet, the people subdued. In the council hall, the flood had not only reshaped the city's streets, it had altered the balance of power. That year's harvest was smaller, and the trade caravans thinner. Yet life resumed. The streets were cleared, the bricks relayed, the temple fires lit once more. But there was a change in the way the people looked at him. Before, they had seen him as the keeper of balance, the guardian of the grid. Now, they saw him as a man who could not hold back the river. The sacred and the political were beginning to separate in their minds, and in that space between them, ambition was already taking root. He began to walk the city more often at night, when the heat eased and the lamps in the narrow lanes burned low. He watched the silhouettes of merchants counting goods in their storerooms, the quiet exchange of coins between hands. In those moments, he understood that the next threat to Mohenjo-Daro would not come from the river, but from within its walls. And unlike the flood, this one would not be announced by rising water. It would come in whispers, in deals struck in shadow, in the slow erosion of trust until one day the city's perfect order collapsed under its own weight. But for now, the streets were dry, and the city still stood. The priest-king's crown, invisible, silent, heavy, remained on his head. Yet somewhere deep inside, the first crack in its foundation had already begun to form. When the waters finally withdrew and the last traces of silt were swept from the streets, Mohenjo-Daro returned to its rhythm, but the rhythm had changed. The flood had stripped the city of its innocence, and in the silence that followed, the grid itself seemed sharper, more defined, as though the city had braced its shoulders against what was yet to come. From the citadel mound, the pattern of Mohenjo-Daro stretched outward with geometric precision. Each street a perfect line, each block a deliberate measure against chaos. To an outsider, it must have seemed invincible. To the priest-king, it was a vast machine, intricate, efficient, but dependent on the constant motion of its parts. And like any machine, it could be broken. The morning light would spill over the city's western edge, casting long shadows down the main avenue. Merchants would roll up their reed shutters, revealing stalls heavy with beads of carnelian, copper ingots, and bundles of cotton cloth dyed in rich indigo. The air would thicken with the smell of spices brought from far coasts and the brine of dried fish from the delta. Men with arms darkened by the sun would lift sacks of grain onto ox carts, their movements measured, the groan of wood on stone echoing through the lanes. In the upper terraces, the wealthier quarters remained orderly and clean, their walls newly replastered, their courtyards swept before sunrise. This was the city's face, a mask of order. Beneath it, unseen currents moved. The Council of Elders had begun to meet more frequently, their gatherings now stretching into the night. Officially, they discussed the rebuilding of the lower quarters, the strengthening of flood defenses, the renewal of trade agreements with distant Harappa and the coastal ports. But the priest-king knew better. These meetings were arenas where alliances were forged and tested, where the merchants, the priests, and the old noble houses each sought to pull the grid's lines toward themselves. The city's grid was not only its streets. It was the invisible network of influence, a lattice of loyalties and debts. At its center stood the priest-king, but he was not the only one who could move its pieces. The merchant houses controlled the flow of wealth. The priests oversaw the festivals and rituals that kept the people's faith alive. The artisans' guilds shaped the goods that made Mohenjo-Daro's name known in far-off markets. The priest-king began a deliberate circuit of the city. He walked the length of the main avenue, through the bustling lower market, and into the narrow residential lanes where the air smelled of wood smoke and damp clay. At every turn, he studied the walls, the drains, the faces. Order, he knew, was as much about perception as it was about reality. If the people saw him among them, moving through the streets without fear, they would believe the city's foundation was still strong. Yet even as he walked, he could feel the weight of watching eyes. In the upper market, a young merchant stood with arms crossed, speaking in a low voice to an older man whose hands were stained with indigo dye. In the courtyard of a noble house, two men leaned over a game board, their conversation halting when he passed. These were not open acts of defiance. Nothing in Mohenjo-Daro's politics was so crude, but they were the pauses in the rhythm, the small hesitations that told him the music was changing. The great bath remained the symbolic heart of the city. Here, the water lay still and dark, broken only by the ripples of ceremonial cleansing. The priest-king kept the rituals intact, knowing that the sight of him presiding over the sacred waters reassured the common people. But he also knew that rituals could not alone hold the grid together. The merchants were pressing for expanded trade with distant lands that lay beyond the river, beyond the known. They saw in these routes not only wealth, but a shift in power. If they could bring riches that bypassed the temple's blessings, their influence could grow beyond the reach of the crown. The first debate came in the council chamber. The priests opposed them, warning that to do so without proper offerings would anger the gods. The noble families watched silently, weighing which way the wind would blow. A single lost alliance could unravel years of balance. But he also understood something the others did not. The city's order was its pride, but it was also its weakness. Too much reliance on perfect symmetry left no room for adaptation. He had seen it in the flood, the drains built to exact dimensions, unable to cope with water beyond their calculated measure. Now he saw it in politics, a system too rigid to bend without breaking. Somewhere, in the spaces between brick and water, between market and temple, he would have to find the flexibility to survive, carrying clay figurines and offerings to the gods. For a moment, the city seemed whole again. But even in the light of celebration, the priest-king felt the pull of opposing tides. The grid was holding, but its lines were being redrawn in places too subtle for most to see. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned the color of copper, he climbed to the highest point of the citadel. Below him, the city lay spread out like a tablet covered in ancient script, a pattern that had endured for generations. The coming years would test whether its perfect grid could bend, or whether it would shatter. The day of the oath began before dawn, when the city was still cloaked in the thin veil of night mist rising from the river. In the western quarter, the great bath lay silent. This was the renewal, a rite meant to reaffirm the priest-king's bond with the gods, the city, and the people who moved within its perfect grid. Merchants in bright-dyed tunics stood shoulder to shoulder with laborers whose hands bore the calluses of brickwork and canal digging. Nobles in patterned cloaks watched from the raised terraces, robed in cloth woven with the emblematic trefoil pattern, a design said to symbolize unity between earth, water, and sky. His headdress caught the morning light, a faint glint in the haze. The crowd fell into a hush that seemed to tighten the air itself. Each step he took down the long stairway was measured, deliberate, as though the weight of the entire city's history pressed upon his heels. The ritual was simple in its motions but vast in its meaning. At the water's edge, he removed his sandals, feeling the chill of the brick beneath his feet. Priests carrying copper vessels approached from either side, their hands steady despite the significance of the moment. One by one, they poured scented water over his head, water drawn from the Indus at first light, filtered through layers of sand and sacred cloth. Each stream ran down his shoulders in pale rivulets, dripping into the great bath until the ripples spread outward like whispers through a crowd. In this stillness, he recited the ancient invocations, words older than the city's walls, their meaning understood by few, their power believed by all. His voice carried low but resonant, the sound wrapping around the brick walls and curling into the listening silence. The elders nodded in solemn approval, the merchants kept their eyes fixed upon him, and somewhere in the throng, a woman's gaze lingered longer than the rest. She was the daughter of a merchant whose caravan stretched across the western deserts. Her presence here both a gesture of respect and a reminder of her family's growing influence. The oath reached its final verse, the one meant to seal his position for another year, the verse that declared the priest-king to be the chosen intermediary between the mortal and divine. It was here that the unexpected happened. A bird, startled from the temple roof above, swooped low across the great bath, its shadow skimming the water just as he raised his hands for the final blessing. In any other moment, it would have been nothing, but the people, already attuned to signs and omens, shifted uneasily, the crowd bowing as he passed. Yet he felt the change immediately, subtle as the shift in the wind before a storm. The merchant's eyes were sharper, measuring. The nobles exchanged glances too quickly to be casual. The priests alone maintained the steady mask of faith, but even they seemed more watchful than before. In the days that followed, the murmurs grew. Some said the bird was an ill omen, a sign that the gods had turned their gaze elsewhere. Others whispered that the priest-king's authority was not divinely ordained but merely the result of political maneuvering. In the upper markets, their paths crossed again at a private gathering in a shaded courtyard, where the scent of ripe dates hung in the air. Her presence was magnetic, not only for her beauty, but for the calculated grace with which she navigated the conversations around her. She spoke little, but listened to everything, and when her eyes met his, there was no bow, no feigned deference, only a quiet recognition, as if she saw the man behind the title. It was a dangerous thing, this spark. Personal desire had no place in the architecture of the grid. Yet, in the long hours of night, as he walked the citadel walls, he found his thoughts returning to her, not only to her face, but to the network of influence her family commanded. In the politics of Mohenjo-Daro, affection and alliance were threads of the same weave. The oath at the Great Bath had been meant to tighten the fabric of his reign. Instead, it had revealed its fraying edges. The signs were small, almost invisible to those who did not live in the shadow of power. But the priest-king knew better. He had seen the way a single loosened brick could compromise an entire wall. And now, the grid still held, but it no longer felt immovable. Somewhere beyond the reach of ritual, the dry season deepened, and with it, the air in Mohenjo-Daro thickened with dust and murmurs. The sun blazed white at midday, bleaching the brick walls until they seemed to glow, the heat radiating off the streets like the breath of a furnace. The priest-king could feel the city tightening under the strain, not of hunger or flood this time, but of ambition. Their goods unloaded into warehouses whose doors remained closed longer than was customary. Behind those doors, deals were struck that did not pass through the temple's sanction. The merchants had grown bolder since the Great Bath Oath. They spoke in their own gatherings now, their leaders hosting feasts in richly decorated courtyards, hints of tariffs being ignored. It was not yet open rebellion, but it was the quiet construction of a rival structure within the city, a shadow grid drawn over the old one. In the council hall, debates grew sharper. The merchant faction pressed for reduced levies on imported copper, arguing that it would strengthen trade with the western ports. The priests resisted, insisting that any goods brought into the city must first receive the temple's blessing and a share of profit. The noble families lingered between them, weighing which alliance would secure their position. The priest-king remained outwardly neutral, but inside he was calculating, mapping the invisible lines of loyalty that shifted with each meeting. It was in this climate that the first strike came. The day was heavy with heat, the air still as stone. The priest-king had spent the morning inspecting the western granaries, A sound like the hiss of wind reached his ear. A heartbeat later, a small blade clattered against the brick beside him, the point glancing off harmlessly but close enough to leave a mark in the wall. He did not move at first. The attacker was gone before his guards reached the scene, no more than a shadow slipping between the storage platforms. The weapon, a small, sharpened bronze knife, lay in the dust at his feet. There was nothing to identify its owner, but the message was clear. The grid was no longer unbroken. The incident was kept quiet. Publicly, it was nothing more than an accident, a drop tool from a worker above. Privately, the Priest-King summoned his most trusted advisors. In the candlelit chamber beneath the temple, that night, as he walked the high terrace of the citadel, the city stretched below him in quiet perfection. The streets were straight, the blocks uniform, the drains running clean beneath. But now he saw that perfection differently, not as strength but as vulnerability. Every street was a line along which an enemy could move unseen. Every intersection a meeting place for whispered plots. The attack had not shaken his resolve. It had sharpened it. He began to move differently through the city, his routes less predictable, his appearances sudden and unannounced. In the markets, he lingered near the merchant stalls, his presence a reminder of the crown's gaze. In the temple, he presided over ceremonies with renewed intensity, each gesture deliberate, each offering to the gods a silent declaration of his endurance. And yet, the danger did not exist only in shadows. The merchant's daughter, the one whose gaze had once cut through the formal distance of titles, remained in his thoughts. Their paths crossed again at a festival marking the turning of the season. Lanterns floated on shallow pools in the courtyards, their reflections swaying with the movement of the crowd. She approached only briefly, her words polite, her eyes unreadable. But he felt the tremor of something unspoken, a thread of connection that could be either a bond or a snare. He could not ignore the possibility that affection and alliance were already tangled in ways he did not control. If her family stood behind the merchant faction, and all evidence suggested they did, then every step toward her was also a step into a web woven for purposes beyond desire. The Priest-King had been taught to master the rituals of water and fire, the flow of grain and trade, the balance of the grid. But no ritual could prepare him for the slow, deliberate reach of human ambition. The blade in the dust had been the first sign. It would not be the last. Somewhere in the city's perfect lines, betrayal had taken root. And like the desert wind that began as a whisper before it became a storm, it was gathering strength, unseen, inevitable. The first sign was not the rain. It was the wind. For days, a restless current moved through the streets of Mohenjo-Daro, slipping between the brick walls and rattling the reed canopies of the market stalls. It carried the scent of wet earth from far to the north, a smell that the oldest ferrymen knew well. In the council chamber, the elders spoke of an unusually heavy melt in the mountains, of tributaries swelling before the monsoon had even begun. The merchants listened but kept their minds on trade, convinced the city's defenses were more than enough. The priests burned incense and repeated the old assurances that the Indus obeyed the gods. But the Priest-King had walked the river's edge as a boy. He knew better. The Indus obeyed nothing. The rains arrived in the night, a slow percussion on the rooftops that became a drumbeat by morning. By the third day, the streets glistened under a steady downpour, the water flowing swiftly into the city's drains. For a time, the system held, the grid's engineering proving its worth. But the river was already rising beyond its banks, and the water pressing in from outside the walls was not the measured trickle of an ordinary season. It was the dark, rolling advance of a force too great to channel. At first, it came through the southern gate, curling into the market quarter like an unwelcome guest. Merchants scrambled to lift their goods onto high platforms, the smell of wet cotton and spices filling the air. Children splashed in shallow pools, laughing, not yet understanding. But within hours, the laughter faded. The pools deepened into channels, the channels into streams, and the streams merged into a broad, relentless flood. The lower streets vanished beneath a shifting brown expanse that reflected the heavy, unbroken sky. From the citadel mound, the priest-king watched the transformation. The grid, his city's proud geometry, dissolved into an archipelago of rooftops and terraces. Oxen and goats were herded to the higher ground. The scent of incense drowned beneath the smell of silt. He descended from the citadel into the waterlogged streets, his robe gathered high, his bare feet sinking into the current. The guards moved with him, but their presence could not mask the vulnerability of the moment. The people needed to see him here, waist-deep in the same water that filled their homes, issuing orders with the force of someone who refused to let the city drown. Workers built makeshift barriers from brick and timber. Others ferried children and the elderly on rafts made from bundled reeds. The river's advance slowed, but it did not stop. In the midst of the chaos, the merchants acted. From their warehouses, they began releasing grain, not to the temple, but directly to the people, their generosity loudly proclaimed. To the hungry, it did not matter that the gesture undermined the temple's authority. It mattered only that they had food. The priest-king saw the shift in the people's eyes. Gratitude for the merchants, tempered respect for the temple. It was a calculated act, and it was working. By the sixth day, the flood reached its height. The southern quarter was gone, the eastern walls under strain. The priest-king slept in short intervals, waking to reports of breaches and collapses. He moved constantly between the citadel and the lower streets, directing the flow of supplies, ordering repairs, standing in the rain until his skin was raw. His hands bled from the rough edges of the bricks, but he did not stop. Leadership was not the act of giving commands from above. It was the choice to remain where the danger was greatest. And then came the moment that would be remembered long after the flood had gone. In the pre-dawn gloom, a section of the eastern wall failed, releasing a surge of water toward the granaries. The guards and workers faltered, some ready to abandon their posts. The priest-king waded into the breach himself, seizing the nearest timber and bracing it into place, shouting for others to reinforce it. The sight of him, soaked, shivering, forcing the wall back with his own strength, ignited the men around him. They moved as one, hauling stone and clay, though scarred, had not been erased. The people whispered that the priest-king had saved them. The merchants countered quietly that without their grain, the city would have starved. The priests spoke of divine favor, though they had spent much of the flood within the dry safety of the upper temple. The priest-king knew the truth. The flood had spared no one, and in sparing no one, it had exposed the fault lines in Mohenjo-Daro's foundation. The people had seen the merchants feed them without the temple's blessing. The merchants had seen how quickly the people's loyalty could shift. And the priest-king had seen, perhaps for the first time, that his throne was not a seat carved in stone but a fragile raft floating on waters that could rise again at any moment. That night, as he stood on the citadel terrace, the city stretched out below him in silence. Pools of water glistened in the moonlight where streets had been. Somewhere in that quiet, he felt the truth settle over him like the weight of the crown itself. The next flood might not come from the river. It might come from within the walls. The flood left more than water stains on the walls of Mohenjo-Daro. It left memory, and memory was a sharper weapon than any blade. Even as the streets dried and the bricks warmed again under the sun, the city could not shake the images of the disaster. The southern quarter drowned, the granaries ringed with hungry crowds, the merchants standing before their open stores while the temple doors remained closed. The water had receded, but the lines it drew in the minds of the people remained. The granaries had always been the beating heart of the city's survival. Raised on massive platforms, their walls thick and cool, they held the wealth that mattered most. Not gold, not beads of carnelian, but grain. Grain was the true currency of the Indus, the difference between life and famine, between loyalty and revolt. The temple was meant to guard it for all, releasing it only under the priest-king's seal. But after the flood, that seal had been broken in the public mind. The merchants had shown they could give without his permission, and the people had taken the grain with open hands and open gratitude. It began with quiet conversations in the shadowed corridors of the granary complex. Workers loading sacks spoke in low tones about the generosity of the merchant houses. Women fetching grain for their households repeated the story of how the merchant's daughter herself had walked among the people, offering food and comfort during the worst days of the flood. Her name spread like a blessing, and with it, her family's influence deepened. In the upper terraces, the council chambers grew tense. The merchants pressed for a new policy, that a portion of the city's grain stores be managed directly by their guilds, bypassing the temple entirely. They spoke of efficiency, of ensuring rapid distribution in times of crisis, of preventing the delays that had cost lives during the flood. The priests resisted with measured outrage, warning that such a move would defy tradition and anger the gods. The nobles wavered, sensing opportunity but fearing the break in order. Yet outright refusal would paint him as the enemy of the people, the man who withheld food from the hungry. It was not a mocking smile, nor one of warmth, but something in between, as if she recognized the position he was in and found it inevitable. Her presence here was not accidental. It was a quiet declaration that the merchants were no longer content to move in shadows. The whispers did not stay within the walls of the council. In the markets, traders began to speak openly about their role in saving the city. The words, "Without the merchants, we would have starved," appeared in casual conversation, repeated enough to harden into truth. One evening, the priest-king descended into the granary complex alone. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of stored grain. He ran his hand over the coarse sacks stacked in perfect rows, each one marked with the seal of the temple. This was the city's lifeblood, yet he could feel how thin the wall had become between his authority and the hands that now reached for it. When they noticed his shadow, they fell silent. The next morning, a shipment of grain bound for the western quarter vanished without trace. Officially, it was blamed on thieves from outside the city, because every missing sack eroded the image of a city in perfect order. Still, he did not move against them openly. Instead, he began to place his own loyal men in the granary operations, instructing them to watch, to listen, to report every deviation from the expected flow. The temple records were reviewed daily, and the grain seals inspected for tampering. These measures slowed the merchant's reach, but they did not stop it. The grid was being redrawn grain by grain, and he was fighting to keep his place at its center. At the next festival, as the city lit with torchlight and music echoed through the streets, the priest-king saw her again. The merchant's daughter stood among her people, accepting greetings with the poise of someone who understood her role in a larger game. Their eyes met across the crowd, and for a moment, the noise of the festival faded. In her gaze, he saw both an ally and an adversary, both the promise of unity and the certainty of conflict. The whispers in the granary had become louder, more confident. Soon, they would no longer be whispers at all. By the time the cool season descended upon Mohenjo-Daro, the city's order was no longer held in place by the strength of its walls, but by the fragile theater of its rituals. The merchants had grown too confident, the priests too defensive, and the nobles too eager to see which way the balance would tip. In this shifting landscape, the priest-king remained the one figure who could still command the city's full attention, but only if the people continued to believe that he was not merely a man, but a chosen vessel of the divine. The festival of the first flame approached, the most sacred day of the year, when the temple fire was rekindled to mark the eternal cycle of the gods' protection. Traditionally, the priest-king would descend into the great bath at dawn, emerge purified, and then ascend the temple steps to light the flame with a single spark taken from the sun's reflection on polished copper. It was a ritual as old as the city itself, a performance of continuity that bound the people to their ruler in a web of faith and order. This year, the merchants, sensing opportunity, insisted that the wealth of their guilds be displayed alongside the ritual. Offerings of grain, textiles, and ornaments carried in procession, so that their role in the city's survival would be as visible as the crown itself. The priest-king agreed outwardly, but inside he understood the danger. To share the stage was to share the power. its surface reflecting the pale light of the dawn. The priest-king entered in silence, his robe heavy with embroidered patterns that glimmered with dew. Stepping down the brick steps, he lowered himself into the water until it reached his chest. The priests chanted from the edges, their voices weaving into the rhythm of the crowd's murmurs. The water was cold, almost biting, but he welcomed it. Purification required endurance. As he emerged from the bath, the crowd parted to let him pass. The temple steps rose before him, lined with priests holding bronze mirrors to catch the first rays of the sun. At the summit, the unlit flame awaited, a tall pyre crowned with oil-soaked reeds. He climbed steadily, its light striking the bronze mirrors in a cascade of golden beams. A single concentrated ray flashed onto the polished copper disc before him, igniting a thin wisp of smoke. The crowd held its breath. The smoke thickened, and then faltered. The wind shifted, scattering the beam just as he leaned forward to catch the spark. For a heartbeat, there was nothing, no flame, no sign of divine blessing. It was the kind of pause that lives longer in memory than any triumph. The priests scrambled to realign the mirrors, their movements urgent but careful, as if they too sensed the fragility of the moment. When the beam finally returned, the flame caught, flaring upward in a sudden burst of light. The crowd erupted in cheers, but beneath the noise there was a faint ripple, an unease that the gods had hesitated. The merchants seized upon that hesitation. In the days that followed, their guilds distributed food and goods, claiming it was to honor the first flame. But the message was clear. When the divine faltered, human hands could still provide. The nobles, ever alert to changes in the current. The priest-king felt the shift in every glance, every pause in conversation. The mask of divinity still covered his face, but he could feel the cracks beneath it. In the solitude of the citadel terrace, he stood above the city at dusk, the last light painting the grid in long shadows. He knew that once the mask slipped, even slightly, could never be restored to its full strength. And somewhere in the streets below, those who sought to replace him were already rehearsing their own performance. The fire still burned in the temple, but he could not shake the memory of the moment it almost didn't. The first smoke appeared on the western horizon. At first, it was mistaken for the low haze of seasonal field burning, a common sight in the dry months. But by midday, the black columns thickened, rising straight into the sky, too dense to be the work of farmers. Messengers arrived at the citadel gates with urgent reports. Caravans returning from the desert routes had been intercepted, their goods seized, their guards killed. The raiders bore the marks of a rival city far upriver, a settlement whose leaders had long resented Mohenjo-Daro's dominance over the western trade. The priests counseled caution, urging offerings to the gods before any rash move. The nobles spoke of honor, of the need to show strength lest other cities test Mohenjo-Daro's resolve. And in the center of it all, the priest-king listened, knowing that the decision before him would not only shape the city's fate, it would also decide his own survival. War was not the way of Mohenjo-Daro. Its strength lay in trade, in the steady flow of goods and grain, not in conquest. But the rival city had chosen its moment well. They had struck after the flood. The priests feared that failure in war would be seen as a sign of divine abandonment, and the people, caught between them, would follow whoever could promise safety. Preparations began swiftly. The city's artisans turned their skills from jewelry and pottery to the making of weapons, short bronze swords, spears tipped with hardened copper, shields of layered hide. Grain was moved from the granaries to supply the fighters, an act the merchants insisted on overseeing. The priest-king assembled a force drawn from the city's own defenders and from allied settlements along the river, a patchwork army that would march upriver to meet the threat. The departure was a spectacle meant to inspire. At dawn, the gates of the citadel opened, and the columns of fighters moved out along the main avenue. The priest-king rode at the head, his robe replaced by armor of lacquered leather, a bronze-headed spear resting across his saddle. The merchants lined the streets, their guild banners fluttering. His throne would not survive the return. The march upriver was slow, the heat oppressive. Scouts reported that the rival city had fortified a narrow bend where the Indus curved between cliffs. To take it would require both speed and precision before reinforcements could arrive. The priest-king studied the terrain, the movement of the river. The battle began with the sound of drums echoing against stone. The river's surface turned gold in the fading light as the first wave of Mohenjo-Daro's warriors advanced along the narrow banks. Arrows hissed from the cliff walls, striking shields and scattering into the current. The priest-king moved among his fighters, directing them to hold the line, to press forward where the defense faltered. The clash of bronze on bronze rang out, the air thick with dust and the sharp tang of sweat and blood. It was not a swift victory. The defenders fought with the desperation of those protecting their only lifeline to the river. But as night fell, the tide began to turn. A sudden breach in the enemy flank allowed Mohenjo-Daro's fighters to push through, seizing the high ground and forcing the rival leaders to retreat into the dark. When the fighting ended, the bend in the river belonged to Mohenjo-Daro. The next morning, the priest-king stood on the cliff's edge, looking down at the water flowing below. Victory had been costly. Too many of his fighters lay silent along the banks, their bodies wrapped for the journey home. The rival city would think twice before striking again, but he knew they were not truly defeated. In the language of trade and war, this was not the end, only the negotiation before the next conflict. When he returned to Mohenjo-Daro, the city greeted him with cheers, the people crowding the streets, the merchants proclaiming his strength, the priests speaking of divine favor restored. Yet, behind the celebration, the victory upriver faded quickly into memory, like the echo of drums swallowed by the wind. For a few months, Mohenjo-Daro moved with the outward rhythm of peace. Markets busy with trade, temple fires steady, processions winding through the streets on festival days. But beneath the surface, the city was no longer whole. The cracks were not in the walls or the drains. They were in the minds of its people, in the invisible lattice of trust that bound the grid together. The first signs came with the harvest. The rains were weaker than usual, the river lower. Grain from the surrounding farmlands arrived in smaller quantities, the sacks lighter than the year before. The farmers spoke of unpredictable weather in the highlands, of soil drying too quickly, of wells running shallow. In the council chamber, the merchants argued for importing more grain from distant settlements, while the priests warned against relying on foreign supply without proper offerings to the gods. The priest-king listened, noting that neither side spoke of helping the farmers themselves. Shortages bred quiet desperation. Prices in the markets crept upward, the weight on the scales not always matching the price called out by the seller. Then came the rumors of meetings, gatherings held at night in the warehouses along the western market. There, away from the watch of the temple, merchants and certain nobles were said to be drafting agreements for the protection of trade routes and emergency control of grain supplies. To those who could read the language of power, these words meant something else entirely. A new order, one where the city's wealth bypassed the priest-king altogether. The cracks deepened when a caravan bound for Harappa was ambushed not far from the city. Officially, the attackers were desert raiders. Unofficially, the caravan had been guarded by men loyal to the merchant houses, and not a single one was killed. The goods vanished, but too many in the council suspected they had simply been redirected. No one accused the merchants openly. Accusations without proof could break the council apart entirely. But the suspicion hung in the air like smoke that would not clear. In the temple courtyard, merchants now stood with the quiet confidence of equals, not supplicants. Even among the priests, he sensed hesitation, as if some were wondering whether their survival might one day depend more on the guilds than on the throne. Late one evening, while walking the upper walls of the citadel, he looked out over the city in the moonlight. From here, the grid was perfect again. Streets aligned in flawless geometry, rooftops glinting faintly. But he knew that from within those streets, the order was fraying. It reminded him of a pot repaired too many times, the cracks hidden under fresh clay but still there, waiting for one hard blow to shatter it. That blow came not from outside, but from the council itself. An elder, long known for his loyalty, brought forth a proposal that stunned the chamber: the creation of a grain oversight committee drawn equally from the temple, the merchant guilds, and the noble houses. It was presented as a safeguard against shortages, but the meaning was plain: the temple would lose its monopoly over the city's lifeblood. The debate was fierce. Voices rose, the air thick with the scent of oil lamps and the sweat of men leaning too far over the council table. The merchants argued for efficiency. The priests invoked the wrath of the gods. The nobles feigned concern for the people. The priest-king spoke only once, reminding them that the city's unity was worth more than any storehouse. But he could see in their eyes that the words no longer held the weight they once had. Outside the chamber, the people continued their lives, unaware of the exact words exchanged but sensing the tension. In the markets, some stalls displayed the merchant seals more prominently than the temples. In the lower quarters, the old prayers were whispered less often, replaced by talk of practical solutions, a phrase that meant different things to different ears. The Indus flowed as it always had, its surface calm, its depths unknowable. But the priest-king had learned long ago that danger was not always heralded by the river's roar. Sometimes it crept upward from the cracks beneath, unseen until the ground shifted underfoot. And now, walking the silent corridors of the citadel at night, he could feel that shift beginning. The city still stood, the grid still held, but the space between the lines was widening, and in that space something new and dangerous was taking shape. The decision came to him in the hours before dawn, when the city lay wrapped in the deep silence between night and morning. He stood alone on the citadel terrace, the wind moving softly over the rooftops, carrying with it the faint smell of wet earth from the river's edge. The stars above the Indus burned clear and cold, and in their light the grid of Mohenjo-Daro stretched below him, still perfect to the eye, still whole in form, yet fragile in ways no star could reveal. The council had met late into the previous evening. The merchants had arrived in fine robes, their guild seals gleaming, the nobles with calculated expressions, the priests in ceremonial white, a relic from a more ordered time. Some of the priests urged resistance, speaking of omens and divine mandate. But even among them he sensed fear. They had begun to imagine a city without him, without the temple's central hold over daily life. And the merchants, emboldened by their reach, no longer bothered to hide their ambitions. They had fed the city during the flood, funded the war upriver, and now they stood ready to claim the one thing that would make their rule complete. The priest-king understood the temptation to fight. He could rally what loyalty remained among the temple guard, refuse the council's demands, perhaps even purge the most dangerous rivals. But he had also seen what happened to cities that tore themselves apart from within. The collapse did not come swiftly, but as a slow rot, leaving behind only walls for the wind to move through. That morning, the city awoke to the announcement of a public rite at the Great Bath. No such ceremony had been planned for this season, and the news spread quickly through the markets and lanes. By midday, the terraces surrounding the bath were crowded, the surface of the water still and dark beneath the open sky. The merchants came, their faces expectant. The nobles took their places in the shade. The priests lined the edges, uneasy but obedient. The priest-king appeared without the heavy embroidered robe of past rituals. Instead, he stepped down into the water slowly, each footfall deliberate, the ripples spreading outward in widening circles. When he reached the center of the bath, he raised his hands not to invoke the gods, but to still the crowd's murmurs. His voice, when it came, was steady, carrying over the water and into the listening silence. He spoke of the city, not as a possession of the temple or the merchants, but as a living thing, greater than any single house or name. He spoke of the floods and the fires, of the victories and the losses, of the way the grid had held through centuries because its lines were drawn for all, not for the power of a few. And then, without warning, he removed the band from his brow and held it out in both hands. In the symbolism of Mohenjo-Daro, this was more than a crown. It was the visible thread that tied ruler to city, man to gods. The priests gasped, the merchants leaned forward, the people shifted in confusion. In a voice that carried the weight of both surrender and command, the sound in the terraces was not a cheer, nor an outcry, but a long, collective exhale, as if the city itself had been holding its breath. The rite ended without music, without procession. Whether that choice would save the city or hasten its fall, no one could yet say. That night, the priest-king walked the streets alone, unguarded, unseen in the shadowed lanes. He passed the granaries, the markets, the quiet wells, seeing them now not as possessions to be guarded, but as parts of a living whole that would outlast him or not. Above, the stars burned as they had on the morning of his decision. The Indus flowed, indifferent as ever, carrying with it the reflection of a city whose future now belonged to others. The days after the last rite passed in a strange stillness, as if the city itself were adjusting to a new rhythm. Without the daily presence of the priest-king on the citadel terrace, the skyline seemed somehow emptier, the grid below less tightly bound. The merchants moved quickly to fill the space he had left. Guild banners began to appear where temple seals once hung. The council chambers, once heavy with incense and ritual, now smelled of parchment and trade agreements. The priests continued their ceremonies, but fewer came to watch. For a time, the city even seemed to thrive. Trade increased, warehouses filled, and the markets pulsed with goods from distant coasts and deserts. Yet the balance that had once been tended with such care was gone. Without the invisible thread that had held water, fire, market, and temple together, the grid began to warp. Not in ways the people noticed all at once, but in slow, subtle shifts. A drain left unrepaired, a well falling into disuse, a quarrel between guilds that flared into street violence before being hushed away. The former priest-king lived quietly in a modest house on the edge of the upper quarter. He kept no attendants, no guards, no seal of office. He walked the streets as an ordinary man, hearing the language of the city change. Where once people spoke of unity and the blessing of the gods, now they spoke of profit, of disputes over weights and measures, of which guild had the greater influence. The sacred was still present, but only as decoration, a faint echo in the corners of a marketplace that no longer looked to the temple for order. Seasons turned. The rains came harder some years, weaker in others. The Indus shifted its banks ever so slightly, as rivers do, undermining foundations along the lower streets. The merchants repaired what they saw fit, but their gaze was fixed on routes and returns, not on the quiet, unglamorous work that kept the city breathing. The nobles adjusted, as they always had, aligning themselves with whoever could promise their survival. The priests withdrew further into their rites, guarding what remained of their authority behind walls fragrant with smoke and flowers. One evening, as the sun bled red over the river, he climbed once more to the citadel mound. It had been years since he'd stood there, years since his shadow had fallen across the perfect lines of the grid from this height. From above, the city still seemed whole, the geometry still crisp against the land. But he could see what others could not, the faint irregularities creeping in, the places where the lines no longer met cleanly, the subtle dark stains where water had begun to seep through the brick. He thought of the great bath of the day he had placed the band upon the water. In his mind, he descended from the citadel and walked to the edge of the city, where the sands began. There, half buried in the shifting grains, lay the old stone effigy, the face that had been carved in his likeness long ago, before his name was forgotten. The eyes still stared outward, heavy-lidded, unblinking, fixed on a horizon that no longer belonged to him. He knelt before it, brushing the sand from its brow, and for a moment it seemed as though the stone might speak. But it did not. The wind rose. No city is eternal, no grid unbroken, no crown beyond the reach of time. When he rose and turned back toward Mohenjo-Daro, the lights of the city flickered faintly in the distance, like embers struggling in the dark. The Indus flowed on, indifferent, carrying reflections of a world that would one day vanish into the same silence that now surrounded him. And in that silence, the city and the man who had once ruled it were already becoming memory.